Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. So welcome, engagers, once again to Professor Game Podcast. And today we have Teresa or Teresa. I don't know how you like that pronounced, but are you prepared to engage? And then you'll correct me.
I am ready to engage.
Let's do this.
I'm from North America, so it's pronounced Teresa around here, but I respond to both.
Sounds good. So Teresa Chan is an associate professor at the McMaster University, and she is the assistant dean, program for faculty development in the Faculty of Health Sciences at McMaster. She's also the director of the RCPSC Clinician Educator Area of Focused Competency Diploma Program and the Competency Committee co-director of the RCPSC Emergency Medicine Residency Program. She also serves as the social media lead for the McMaster Department of Medicine. She is definitely interested in developing medical education innovations and evaluating them, of course. And she has, for example, co-developed and is evaluating a serious game about emergency department flow called Gridlocked. So gridlockedgame.com if you want to follow that. And she also enjoys writing music, and you can follow her on tchanmd on Twitter, or we can check out her work at tchanmd.com. So is there anything we're missing that you think we should have, Dr. Chan?
No, that's great. My favorite game is Breath of the Wild from Legend of Zelda, so that's probably important too.
So we got to that very quickly, and that's awesome. We got that kind of out of the way. Why is that your favorite game?
Oh, I just think that it's a pretty amazing game. It's so you can really dive into a new world and explore. I guess for some people who aren't in healthcare, Gridlocked is an example of a game that can be pretty immersive. I've had good experiences playing with fairly junior people like high schoolers and people that are pre-medicine or early in their medical career and or nursing careers, and they really find it's a taste of what the real life is like. For some of our clinicians, they find it a little bit freaky how similar it is to real life, and so they are like, I guess it would be kind of like playing that pandemic game in the middle of all of this COVID pandemic stuff, right? So sometimes when life is too close to reality, it can be a little bit weird when you're playing the game.
Interesting. And we'll get into details about that because you're talking about some of the things that you do, some of the things that you like. And we'd like to know, I know you're also a doctor and teaching medicine. So what does a day look like, or what are the kinds of things that might be composing your days nowadays?
Oh. That's interesting. Right now, I'm a clinician educator, so that means I'm a clinician first in many ways. My hospital appointment is that I work in the emergency department, and I know not all of our listeners will know about a specialty called emergency medicine because, there was a show about it in the US that ran for 20 years, so I think a lot of people kind of know about it, but it's actually not a specialty in every jurisdiction. So just kind of highlighting it. I'm not an anesthetist, I'm not an internist, I'm actually an emergency physician. I trained in a 5-year training program to get here. So that's kind of cool. And my day-to-day right now is pretty hit or miss because emerge docs tend to have very strange schedules. So right now during the pandemic, normally I would work 6 to 7 shifts a month because I have a lot of academic work. But that's kind of ground to a halt a little bit right now. So I'm not flying across countries. I'm not presenting everywhere. And so right now we're really focusing on the clinical care. And so I guess this is being recorded on April 10th, 2020, and I'm crossing my fingers right now because unlike some of our other colleagues in other countries, we're still kind of like tsunami of sick COVID-19 patients. So right now we're just kind of bracing for impact and preparing. So we're using a lot of simulation, which is creeping into our work environments. We're doing a lot of cool stuff with regards to digital CME right now to make sure that people are up to snuff. We have our podcast, MacAbridge Podcast, which is putting out special episodes about updates on the science. And I've been pretty up on the social media stuff to make sure that people are informed and are prepared for the upcoming onslaught of patients that we know are coming because it's happened everywhere else in the world.
It is. It definitely is. And I think I'm by no means a specialist in the area. I'm actually pretty far from an engineer in a business MBA. So
Yeah.
far from it. But from observation,
Hmm.
what I've seen is being prepared is probably the only, or actually the best tool that any country and its people can have. So congratulations on that. And, some luck was involved in the process, I'm sure.
Yeah, so hopefully we will keep with our preparations, and hopefully developers like yourself who are engineers or business people come through with us with more personal protective equipment, because that's been a shortage everywhere in the world, right? The supply chain is kind of
Yes.
destroyed right now. So we are trying to have, it's actually our engineers and our business people who are stepping up to convert their businesses. And so we're really thankful for people like yourself who are able to step up and help serve the country when it's in its time of need too. So that's great. And then, so that's part of my job. And then the other part is that we still have a medical school. We still have medical students to teach. So we've been doing some digital transformation of our curriculum. The medical students actually have been pulled back from the front lines. So we're just trying to protect them from harm's way. And so for now, all our medical students are getting like a virtual curriculum. And so we've been experimenting with different designs. We were using Slack to do some direct messaging back and forth. We've been doing some, simulation cases where we'll play a simulation video and then we'll debrief. Because there's evidence that says that watching a simulation and then debriefing is probably just as educational. And we're doing some case-based discussions with them. And kind of like this, we're just having conversations with them. And that seems to be really awesome. Our residents are, in the meantime, fully qualified doctors who actually do clinical care. They're being paid. And so they are deployed in the emergency department. And so that's pretty awesome that we can have them participate and be there with us. We're trying to minimize the harm to them as well. And that's kind of the name of the current game, at least for us.
Good, good. Hopefully it'll just get better before it gets worse, which is the best thing that we can that
Mm-hmm.
we can wish for right now, I'd say.
Mm-hmm.
But moving from, I know it's almost impossible to have a conversation nowadays and not talk, even if just a little bit, about everything that's going on.
Yeah.
Moving on a little bit from that, hopefully this will be listened to not only in these days, but in the future as well,
Mm-hmm.
where, I'm saying hi to those people who are
Mm-hmm.
happily listening to this and saying, good Lord, finally this is over.
Yep, it's true.
So we would like also to speak to those future selves of
Yeah.
ourselves and, learn a little bit about your experience. And we always like to start with failure. And we'd like to call this sort of your first attempt in learning,
Mm-hmm.
your favorite fail. There's many ways to focus it, but in the end, it's, a situation that didn't go as expected or didn't go well
Mm-hmm.
and went sideways somehow. And of course, it probably involved simulations, games, gamification, or
Mm-hmm.
something similar. And it seems you're very into it, both in the education and in your, your regular job as well.
Yep. Mm-hmm. So yeah, failure is something that doctors are not well known to, fail really well. And it's something that we've been trying really hard to actually bring that kind of gamification approach in our continuous learning. And so that is something that I've been fascinated with since I was in residency. I had the chance actually to deploy and create a competency-based medical education program that had a lot of elements of gamification within it to have people kind of gather the right workplace-based assessments to prove that they're, like doing all the things that a doctor in our field should do. And it's kind of like when you build something up and you've got this giant sandcastle and then the waves of time come along and the whole country decided to move into competence-based medical education. And even though we had a really good pilot, basically people went, yeah, whatever. They pushed over my sandcastle. And now we actually have a national platform that is in some way informed by our experiences. So it's not all lost, right? It's still the same sand. It's just recombined in a different way. But, it's to me, that was kind of a failure in some ways because, like we weren't able to keep our system running. And on the plus side, we learned a lot and developed some evidence around what we do. And that informed the national kind of workplace-based assessment system. So I think that we've learned a lot of tricks along the way and done some good work that could lay down the foundation to other people being successful now. So hopefully, it wasn't for all for naught. And in many ways, I felt fairly privileged because I heard from people that were helping develop these resources for the national platform that they had our, manuals and our books right there in the room with them. So I guess it wasn't a complete failure, let's say, but it definitely was something that helped me learn, like the politics of things and understand that sometimes you could do a great job and it can be running really well, but people still might want to knock over your sandcastle.
And I know sometimes we say I wouldn't change a thing because it wouldn't be here otherwise. And that's, I respect that. And I think it's true in many ways. But if you had a chance to do something different, maybe to improve it, maybe to already taking the lessons learned, would you do something different? What would you do different? What did you like from your learnings that you took? What would you change maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the elements that I've worked into more of my design now in the second time around, and thinking about user experience for workplace-based assessments and creating those kind of user experiences, is that actually gaming and gamification is a really good application and lens to fold in. You want to make sure that the game is seamless. You want to make sure that the game is usable, that it's intuitive, that it's not frustrating for people to use. And all of those things can really copy and paste over to any kind of other software platform design. And so what I found was that all the stuff I read about in terms of great game design actually has made me a better assessment designer. And I now think about all those elements of usability and understand much better what it is that helps compel people or nudge people in the right direction. And I think that the gaming world has given me a lot of tools now that we folded in as we are deploying and rolling out our workplace-based assessment systems.
That sounds fantastic. I think it's a great learning, and it's what we're all about, learning and strategizing from what we see and what we learn in games. And we'd like to make a spin on this and actually go for not a time of first attempt in learning or failure. We'd like to go for a time when you set out to do something. It could be the game you mentioned at the start. It could be something else, but it actually went at least sort of the way you wanted it, or in some capacity we would like to call it a success. And what were the things that you'd attributed to that? Give us a little bit of background. Of course, we want to learn from that experience with you.
Yeah, well, I would actually say that Gridlocked is exactly that story. Gridlocked, there wasn't a lot of unplanned failure, let's put it that way, right? So basically, I was finishing my thesis work, and I did my master's at University of Illinois at Chicago and their Master's of Health Profession Education program. And it's a thesis-based program, and so I did this fairly ambitious thesis with 3 studies embedded in it. And it was probably everybody at the end was like, "You did a dissertation," and I'm like, shut up! You should have told me that earlier." Anyway, and so what happened was that we ended up actually folding together a nice little package of science about how people teach and learn in multi-patient environments. And then my friend Matt Mercury, he's a doc here as well. He's a PhD non-physician who does a lot of research and research co-director here at McMaster Division of Emergency Medicine. And he and I were having coffee, and he was like, "Hey, what's going to go on after we're done your thesis? What's next in this line of work?" And so we're both kind of giant board game nerds, and I just kind of riffed on the idea that actually to prepare for things like pandemics or mass casualty events, actually disaster simulations have always been done on tabletops. So often you'll have a whole city, or even the White House apparently did these in the summer before the pandemic, before the transition from Obama to Trump. And they actually do these tabletop exercises where it's kind of like a war game. They think about how they would actually do all the different moves in a simulation. And so those kind of simulations exist, and we often use them for ironing out emergency situations. And a lot of those are currently right now in the COVID-19 pandemic being used. And so those have existed for decades now. And I was inspired by that, knowing that in many ways, every day is kind of a disaster in the emergency department really now, because we often have more patients than we have resources for. That's why patients are kind of flowed to the hallway to be admitted to no bed, and then they kind of stay in the hallway. At least that's the way it is in Canada. And so I thought, could we take the lessons I learned, which is that there really isn't a platform to safely teach the apprenticeship and the thinking around multi-patient environments outside of the emergency department. Maybe we could.
Sorry, you've mentioned it twice, and for us non-medical, what do you mean by multi-patient environment?
So most of the time, that's a great question, by the way. Most of the time in medical education, at the very least, people are seen in sequence. So in a clinic, for instance, your family doctor sees you kind of maybe one at a time. They might bounce between the rooms a little bit, but like they have a smaller clinic and you'll cycle through one patient at a time. That happens with all our specialist clinics as well. And so people are kind of seeing in almost a conveyor belt fashion, right? Like you have one patient and then another and another, and clinics are booked, in sequence of 10, 15, 20-minute aliquots. So to give that amount of time to each of the patients. A multi-patient environment is when you have multiple patients being seen or managed or diagnosed consecutively, but also in tandem, in parallel. And so, for instance, on a busy shift, I might see a patient in one bed, write some initial orders, see another patient, write some initial orders, see a third patient, write some initial orders, come out of the room, and I have to review some cases with my residents or medical students. And then I'll jump back in and see if some of the tests are back for all the different people. If not, I'll see some more patients. And then you're kind of constantly juggling, sometimes up to 6, 12, 16 patients at a time.
Wow.
Which is not the way that people usually do it, right? So you could think about the difference between, I don't know, the workflows at McDonald's, for instance, right? McDonald's is kind of like you go up to the counter, you make the order, and then that person kind of gets you that order, or you put your order in at the computer station now, and then eventually someone makes the order and then you walk off. That's kind of like the idea is that there's multiple orders being juggled in the back, right? And so it's not like, you as a customer, you're like, oh, I've been waiting for the doctor for a long time. But what you don't see is that there's like 16 other patients that needed my attention too. And so I've been balancing between all of their needs, right? And so that's kind of like the description of a multi-patient environment. And so an average day, we're seeing that many patients. And so that's a skill, and it's probably just like juggling. You don't start to juggle 16 balls at once. You got to start off somewhere else. You got to understand the concepts, and you need to understand how to throw and catch first and all those other things. And so, yes, there's some core basic skills that a medical student might need to have in order to juggle more than one patient at once. And they have to know and the properties of, just like juggling, you have to know the properties of the thing you're trying to juggle. And so medical students often see one patient, think about them really hard, and then they come and talk to me, and then we adjust things, and then they'll see another patient. And they might cycle back, they might balance 3 patients at once, right? But what they are is that they're trying to figure out the properties of each of those individual patients. So eventually, you can start to combine them in different ways. And as you get more expert as a resident, you can juggle a couple more patients. And then when you're a practicing physician, the idea would be that you should be able to balance all the needs of the patients currently under your care.
Wow, that's impressive. And what did this lead you to as far as gridlocked?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you think about it, you have to go from a medical student who's seeing one patient at a time, which means an 8-hour shift, they'd only see 8 patients. And some shifts, let's say our urgent care center, I might be seeing 40, 50 patients in like less time, actually, 6 or 7 hours. And so how do you get someone who can see a patient an hour to seeing many, many patients an hour? And that was a black box mystery to me when I started my thesis, because basically I realized one day when I was a 5th-year resident, I was staring at the tracker board and I was like, I know about every single patient, and I'm currently balancing 16 different patients. And I know what I need to do for every single one of them. How the heck did I get here? And I looked at the first-year resident that was working with me and I'm like, how do I go from them to me? And so that was the question, right? And sometimes those use-inspired questions are the coolest kind of questions you can ask as one of these translational teachers that I am, right? Like, so I see the world, I live in that use-inspired kind of design world and research world. And so sometimes I'll design something if there is good research, but then I went and did a lit review and there wasn't much. And so I came back out and I said, okay, cool. So we can probably develop something for this space. And so after my thesis work, I realized there was a need. The need is that there isn't a safe, simulated environment that allows people to learn this skill. And we do actually have some, I guess, mass casualty event simulations that run. So every year, usually in Toronto around this time, there is a college around here that integrates paramedic students, police students, nursing students, and doctors and residents all together in a 3-hour simulation with like 700 people involved. And we like simulate a disaster situation, like a building collapsing. And that takes a lot of money, you can imagine.
Of course.
Having all the staff and all the volunteers and all the facilitation, even just buying lunch is quite expensive, right? So that probably would be amazing to do, but we can't do that probably more than once a year. And in fact, once a year is pretty phenomenal. Like that's the only mass casualty event that I know is that consistent. And so on the flip side, if that's the case, then we need other ways to do it. And knowing that the disaster planners, like I said, have always used tabletop exercises, which are really just serious games, right? We thought, well, couldn't we make a board game about the emergency department and have patients as the cards and providers that you can move around the board and simulate and, I guess, gamify in many ways the experience of balancing multiple patients.
Wow, that sounds very exciting and interesting. I won't get into the technical details because probably like 90% of the audience will not know too much about the topic in particular. Uh-huh. But it seems like you had many, many lessons from that. Can you summarize it in one, maybe two lessons that you got from that experience?
Yeah, so I think 3 big lessons would be, number 1, when you're developing a game, you need to have other people to develop it with. So this is not usually a solo enterprise, especially if you have a fairly complex game that's meant for multiple players. You need a good team that'll back you up. And so number 1 is that find that team. And in our case, it was a bunch of medical students who stood up and volunteered. And shortly after, I had a conversation with Matt. Matt also helped. We also roped in our program director for our residency program, Aleem Pardon. And so then we had like a full team. We got some real data from Aleem. The med students kind of like went through, and while they were learning about cases, they also wrote up the little cards, and they played a lot of and created the game architecture. They did the funnest literature review you could do, which is I told them to go play a bunch of games and tell me what they liked about them. and then we kind of like put all our heads down and try to make the game better, right? And so lesson number 2 was that your first draft is never the best draft. My first draft actually was, I got obsessed with the idea as I was walking home from having coffee with Matt. And by the time I got home, I like drew a temporary board that resembled actually a lot like the pandemic game. And I said,
when you mentioned Matt, that's your director?
Yeah, Matt was the co-research director that was having coffee with me that night. And so I texted him that night and said, hey, I think I have an idea. I think I exactly know what it looks like. We should get on this. And he's like, haha, LOL. And then 2 weeks later, I was sitting with a med student who wanted to do research and education with me. And I said, hey, there's like 5 projects I'm working on, and I had this really cool idea. And then I told him about Gridlock, and his eyes just lit up, and he was like so excited. And he recruited a bunch of his friends and colleagues who were also interested in emergency medicine and games as well. So that became our first team. So Daniel Soy, Paula Sneath, and Josh Rempel came out of kind of nowhere to help us, and they were amazing. And then along the way, Simon Huang and Rebecca Nyok also came along as summer students to help the next summer to help us really bring this game to life.
Nice. Very, very exciting. And talking about all these things that you've done, if you've faced another challenge like this one, or if you've done it many times, do you have some sort of way of approaching it? Maybe a process or, a framework for thinking. Do you have something like that?
Yeah, so I guess that's lesson number 2 is keep really good records when you're doing stuff like this. So I had 3 lessons, right? So number 2 is, you never know if you're going to want to do something over again, right? And so ever since I was younger and I ran events in the past, I like to have a little diary of how I went through and did stuff. And so what I found was I kind of kept like a little diary of how we put Gridlock together and when we played stuff and when we decided to, change things. And then I also asked the students to do that. And that was very helpful for 2 real reasons. Number 1 was that when we were writing our paper up for academic medicine to describe the innovation, it was very, very, very useful to have all our documents, and I know when we did what, and when we presented something or when we pilot tested things for the first time and things like that. So that was pretty awesome. And number 2 is that a couple of years later, Paula, one of our students who was on the team, is now our PGY2 resident, but in her first year, she, myself, and one of the co-medical directors of our pre-hospital paramedic system, basically, emergency medical services system, decided to make a new game. And so it was really nice to have all the notes to go back to and think, oh, how can we make that? And so that's another game. You can find out more about it at their website as well, but it's called Triaged, and it's about learning about mass casualty triage so that people can understand who's a patient that might need immediate care, need some stabilization, maybe can wait until they can be transported to hospital, or heaven forbid, if they aren't expected to survive, right? And so we need people to be able to know this off the top of their heads because this sometimes happens. And I think, unfortunately, people are having to use that kind of triaging skill right now in some of the cities around the world. And so it's actually something that people actually have to know pretty quickly off the top of their head. And so it's important for people to actually learn it and really know it. And so they've created that game.
That sounds great. That sounds very, very fantastic. And keeping those notes was great. Is there any way that we can like access all of these things? Is that open source? Or the notes?
I'm not sure they'd be really that useful to anyone else, but yeah, I can see if I can dig them up, I guess. But yeah, they're
like
not,
a blog post or something. Like, what was your experience looking like?
Yeah, we've done some of the reflection pieces. And in fact, most of the notes turned into our academic medicine article, which is now open access to everyone. So if you just look in, I think it's December 2018 of academic medicine, there's an article about gridlocked. So you can actually just read that. And it's probably a more polished version than the notes themselves. So
That's great. That's great. Just a quick break before we continue with this episode. If you've been enjoying this podcast, I would really appreciate if you share it with your friends and family and on social media. On Twitter and Instagram, it's at RobAlvarezB and the hashtag ProfessorGame, all one word. And in Facebook, you can find the Professor Game page. Thanks in advance for your engagement. So, Teresa, what would you say that is sort of an element or an idea, strategy that you would say, well, if you're thinking of creating an educational game or, a serious game or one of these things, what would you say something that maybe is not a silver bullet, but something that could help improve, help you make it better, quicker, whatever that looks like?
Yeah, so I guess that's my tip number 3 is think about what assets you have in your team, just like you would if you're doing a multiplayer game or, even playing Legends of Zelda. You got to look in your bag and see what you've got. And then you can figure out what skill sets you either need to learn or you can try to find someone. And so I do have some capacity to do some graphic design stuff. I've been doing little bits of graphic design since I was in high school. So I was going to do a bunch of the layout, but then along came Simon, who's one of the superstar residents now at Dalhousie University. But when I first met him, he was a med student looking for a summer research project. And so he came along and he'd been doing some infographic design work for one of the blogs that I write for, canadian.org. So it's a blog for emergency medicine providers. And he'd been working with us for a little while designing infographics to translate boring medical papers into something that people might want to read about, right? So just like the infographics that you get from, whatever company, from Marriott or whatever, the idea would be that you could look at a digest of a paper in infographic format so that you could actually understand it quickly and then maybe dive deeper into the papers. And so Simon had a lot of experience now with doing and making these graphics. And so I asked him, hey, I've got this project. If you've got graphic design skills, I could definitely use your help. It was amazing that he just really stepped up and that summer kind of helped design the entire game. And so the game that you can buy now is actually the game that Simon pioneered and basically looks the same as when he first started making it. So it was pretty amazing, right? So I think that you just have to look around for the skill set you need and hopefully you can network and find the people that can help make your dreams happen. And so really proud of Simon for the way that his career has progressed, and he's giving international talks and stuff like that now, and he's just a first-year resident, so about infographics and stuff. So it's been really cool to kind of see him progress.
That's great. That's great. And you recommended in a way Simon as your graphic designer for the game. I would like another recommendation. Is there anybody you would like to listen to in an interview like sort of this one or the ones you've listened to before for Professor Game?
Sorry, can you?
Yeah, it's like when you listen to an episode, you say, "Oh, I would really like to listen to this person being interviewed in Professor Game."
Oh, okay. So, I guess one of the docs that's been inspired kind of like by the success of Gridlocked, he actually has developed his own game to help medical students understand what antibiotics to prescribe. And so his name is Michael Cosamini, and he's in California. He has an interesting story and he comes from a different perspective. He's made like a card game that kind of helps people very quickly learn what antibiotics to use. It's really funny because I actually did help him peer review and improve his game along the way. So I happened to be thanked on the box, which is kind of nice of him. But I think the most impressive thing would be that I have a lot of medical people, pharmacists, and my dad and sister are doctors. And so at Christmas time, we played the pilot version of the game. And my partner, who's a lawyer by training and not in medicine, he was like, yeah, I'll figure it out. It's just like any other game. And so he played with us. And then he now knows what you should prescribe for most pediatric infectious disease situations, which is pretty amazing. So he's also got a phenomenal memory, so that's part of it too. But so if Bruce can learn antibiotics, most medical students should be able to do it too. So that's been, like surprising, but I think he's got an interesting story to tell as well. So I'd love to see him featured on the game, Professor Game, obviously.
So Mike Cosmini.
Yeah. I can hook you up on Twitter and tell him that I DM you both.
Sure. And continuing with recommendations, would you, to this audience, to people who are interested in educational games, gamification, serious games, and so on, is there any book that you would recommend, again, within that area, or something else to get inspiration or whatever you think would be appropriate?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think people have mentioned her before, but Jane McGonigal's work is fantastic. So I definitely think that her work is something that's worth looking at.
Absolutely.
She's kind of famous. She's got some TED Talks and stuff like that, which I think is pretty awesome. So if you don't have time right now to read a whole book, that's okay. You can just look her up on the TED website, and she's got a bunch of TED Talks, and that's great. But yeah, I really liked her Reality is Broken book. So I would say that's a high up there recommendation for myself.
Absolutely. And continuing for recommendations, we'd like to go the other way around now. Taking a look at yourself, what would you say is your superpower, your sweet spot, that thing that you do probably better than at least most of the other people in this serious games creation?
I'm kind of new to the circuit, so I don't know that I'm have superpowers yet, but I think that what I'm bringing to it right now is that I'm seeing the opportunities in spaces that people might traditionally not have seen by trying to look across the way to other fields like business and engineering and see what people have done there, but also bringing my inspiration from the clinical world into this gaming circuit. And so our most recent it's in pre-press right now in Simulation and Gaming Journal, is that we have a paper on the post-market surveillance of Gridlocked. So we got an ethical exemption because it's kind of a process improvement project, but we've been polling people as they come in and express interest on Gridlocked to tell us what they're going to buy their game for, and then we map whether or not they actually end up, buying the game, and then whether or not, in a follow-up survey, how they used it, right? And so what's interesting is that the number one side effect for our game right now is fun, because people are often buying it they're buying it to teach, but often they'll find it's fun enough that they play with their family. And sometimes they also find that it's also co-educational for their kids to understand what they do, for instance. It's right now recommended for 18 and up because I didn't really know what to put the age at. And it's got some gory details, but everyone's been making fun of me. They're like, well, these kids, they play like Fortnite and it's way more way more violent than that. And I'm like, yeah, that's true. Anyway, but we'll probably drop the age because I've heard there's reports of small children in South Africa who wake up their dads who are merge docs to say, hey, can we play the game before we go to work, kind of thing. So obviously it's a game that people can learn, and it's kind of fun. And so I don't know, we figured understanding what people were buying it for and then what they actually use it for was actually really important, so we can continue to innovate the game and improve it.
That sounds great. And Teresa, before we go, do you have any final piece of advice for people who are diving into this or are maybe into the field? Is there anything that you would like to tell the engagers and all these people?
I think that if you just have an idea, you should just go out there and prototype it. I think it's pretty amazing now that there are lots of custom board game or card game designers where you can upload your graphics, and they don't have to be super fancy. Like Mike did a pretty good job with just a pattern and then words, right? You don't have to do things that are super fancy, and you can create a pretty fun game. I think it's never been easier to kind of take something from your mind and turn it into reality. So I think that you should get out there and try something, right?
Yes, absolutely. Go out there and prototype and do your own thing is definitely a recommendation I always enjoy. Mm-hmm. So thank you very much, Teresa. We really enjoyed your time together. For me, it was very mind expanding because I've in the medical field, I admire very much what you guys do, but I've never felt I'm not sure if capable or my mind is not structured around doing the kinds of awesome things that you're capable of doing. But I really enjoyed this interview and getting a bit into that world.
Yeah.
So first off, thank you for all of that.
No
let
worries.
us know where. Sorry?
I said no worries. I think actually Gridlocked might be the game you need then, because it doesn't require you to know all the actual medical stuff, and you can still play. A lot of my friends who are in MBA school and such, my cousin who's a computer engineer, he's like, yeah, I played it with my friends. It was pretty fun. Here's some suggestions. So
That sounds great.
this might be the game you need.
Perhaps it will be. So, Teresa, where can we find more about your game? I know I mentioned it at the start, but I always like to leave this final period as well for people to, jot down their notes to where to find you on the internet. What's the best place? Find more about your game or games. Where can we do that?
Yeah, so most of our games are actually posted about on our website. So it's gridlockedgame.com. So gridlockedgame.com. So gridlockedgame.com. And you can find out more there. There's videos on kind of like what it looks like and some literature around like different things that we've been featured in the news for, et cetera, et cetera. So you can kind of check out what the game's all about through all of that stuff. Triage is also hosted off of that site. And hopefully when we get around to it, we'll have some expansion packs and such where people can learn about different situations as well. So we're probably going to create one about a virus that takes over your world. So that's probably going to be something that we should probably make an expansion pack for. And then we'll also have a sister game called Discharge, which will really be about optimizing discharge processes for the inpatient setting. So when people get admitted to hospital, to help people learn about the flow of the hospital outward. So that's in development, but will probably be in a year event horizon at least.
Nice. Thank you very much once again. All that cool stuff. But where can we also find Teresa? Is there anywhere we can talk to you?
Yeah, so you can check out my website at tchanmd.com. So that's that. Or you can check out myself on Twitter, tchanmd as well. So
Cool. T-Chan, so TCHANMD, like medical doctor.
Yeah,
you can find the .com, the Twitter account. You can find Teresa in all these places. Thank you very much for being with us today. It was very fulfilling, very, very interesting. However, for now, and at least for today, it's time to say that it's game over. Engagers, thank you for listening once again to Professor Game Podcast. And if you want more incredible interviews or actually incredible guests like Teresa, then please go to professorgame.com/subscribe and get started in our email list. That way we'll be in contact and you'll be the first to know of any opportunities, questions, direct interactions that Professor Game or me can have for you. And I would really like to, call you to also subscribe to using your favorite podcast app, which is where you're listening to right now, hopefully, except if it's on the web, and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.